learn how to communicate and market to our clients a little bit more better and more targeted. We learn different motivations, different lifestyles, different hopes, different fears that our clients may have as well. What are some other reasons that we look at generations? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Why we want to talk about why we look at various generations? So we're also looking at shared experiences. So some of the shared experiences that occur are, we know that the various shared experiences shape attitudes and viewpoints, and certainly changes behavior, priorities, and tastes. And my question for you would be, what do you remember? So if we kick off and start with our oldest living generation, that would be the GI generation. So the GI generation was born in 1901 to 1924. Now, this group is dwindling, as we know, and in fact, today they represent just less than 0.5% of the US population. So there's not too many of our GI generation folks that are left, that are still with us. And what we know is that there's 1.3 million of them. They're 98 years and older this year. Some of the descriptors that we have for our GI generation are that they're energetic, they're patriotic, they're courageous, loyal, community-oriented, hardworking, team players, and they have a respect for authority. Those are some of the descriptors that we've got for our GI generation. And as I mentioned, there's not a whole lot of them left making real estate decisions, but there are some. In fact, they represented about 2% of real estate transactions in 2021. So that's our GI generation. And I'm sure that there's no one in the room from our GI generation, correct? So we'll move on to our next generation. Our next generation is the silent generation. This group is born 1925 to 1945. They represent just over 6.5% of the population at about 21 million folks. And this particular group is 77 to 97 years old. Our silent generation is known as being cautious, conformist, risk averse, unimaginative, industrious, prudent, and unquestioning of authority. This is our silent generation, unquestioning of authority. Now, why are there any members of our silent generation in the room? Okay, so why do you think that what was taking place during the coming of age of our silent generation? Why do you think that they got the descriptor of being, cautious, conformist, risk averse, unquestioning of authority? Why do you think some of those descriptors, came into our vernacular for this particular generation? So if we think about what was taking place with this group, we have to think about the times, because with this group being born 1925 to 1945, what we know is that they were coming of age. And when we talk about coming of age, we're really discussing the period of time when they start to become aware and make decisions on their own. That's sort of those teenage years and early adult years. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about coming of age. So if we think about this group, they were coming of age in the 1940s. So they were off to war. We had a world war that we were dealing with that really shaped a lot of the sort of thoughts and views of this particular generation. Also, as they were younger, many of them were still part of the Great Depression. And certainly, even if they were born after the Great Depression, their parents were part of the Great Depression. So a lot of their sensibilities came from their parents, that level of frugality that they had in terms of, what the level of frugality in terms of, not wasting things and making sure that you've got that nothing goes to work and everybody gets in line to do what's necessary for the good of the family and for the good of the country when we look at World War II. because with World War II, what we know is that we had a situation in our nation where we had to, everybody had to pick up and do what was best for the country. Women who were not working outside of the workforce at the time in large numbers. In fact, if we look at 1950, what we know is that less than 30% of women worked outside of the home. So that's important for us to consider as we move forward in discussing some of these different generations. Because what was happening is that the women were going to work because the men were off overseas at war. So everybody was doing what they needed to do for the good of the country. So it didn't create a lot of space for people to be sort of thinking outside of the box. And that's where that cautious, conformist, unquestioning of authority sort of space comes in with this particular generation. A couple of other things that we've got with the silent generation is, if we look at how our nation was changing. Anybody else have any thoughts about what else might have been taking place as the silent generation was coming of age? So let's move on to our baby boomers. So our baby boomers, they're born 1946 to 1964. They represent just over 21% of the population, and their numbers are about 70, just over 70 million, 70.5 million. And in 2022, this group is 57 to 75 years old. So who are my baby boomers in the room? I see. Joe, did you have it looks like you've got your hand up. Did you have a question or a comment?
No, I'm a baby boomer, and I'm just proud to be a baby boomer.
All right, I love it. Thank you, Joe. And I'll tell you what, Joe, since we've got you, let me read you some of these descriptors. Ambitious, optimistic, individualistic, immediate gratification, hardworking, competitive, materialistic, and forever young. How does that sit with you, Joe? Does that seem to identify your generation fairly well?
Pretty much. I'd say that really describes my generation. I'm all of the above, except that I'm not that materialistic, but I'm very motivated.
Got it. Fantastic. So with this group, with your group, Joe, coming of age in the sort of late 50s and 60s, what were some of the things what are some defining moments that sort of encapsulate our baby boomers? What are some defining moments that you can think of that kind of shaped your life or shaped the lives of your generation?
I would say that probably the going to the moon was huge. The assassinations of JFK and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, those were powerful moments. And also a society that the kids just, lived, they were happy-go-lucky, whether you lived in the inner city or you lived in the suburbs, the kids basically, were out late and would be home by the time the streetlights came on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joe. Thanks for sharing that. Certainly different times. And when we look at it from, we had a revolution, during the 60s in terms of equal rights, for women. Women were demanding equal rights, which certainly wasn't the case prior to that. We had civil rights and the Fair Housing Act, those types of things that were really pushed by our baby boomers. We also know that, we've got a war. We've got another war. We talked about the war that we had with our silent generation, which of course was World War II. The baby boomers were a product of those soldiers for the most part. That's why they got the name baby boomers, the soldiers coming home from war and, starting families. The baby boomers, of course, the war associated with them is the Vietnam War. And of course, as we know, our country treated the Vietnam War much differently than World War II in terms of its popularity, for lack of a better word. Because what we know is that there was a lot of protesting and a lot of people that just didn't want to go in terms of the draft, in terms of going to fight overseas, and that was a real challenge. Some of our soldiers, it was a shame that they were treated so terribly, during that period of time, and that was, that was a really defining moment for our baby boomers, because not only for, especially for the ones that didn't go and that were protesting, because they were protesting a lot of things. They were protesting the status quo. As I mentioned, equal rights for women, civil rights for different races in our country and ethnicities. Those are things that the environmental movement started to take hold with our boomers as they were coming of age, making decisions. We also saw a lot of other things. What are some other things we saw? We saw women begin to work outside of the household once again, because if we go back to World War II and our silent generation, when the soldiers came home, the women went back home too. However, not all of them wanted to, and that sort of, had that taste of being part of the workforce outside of the home, and it was something that was a desire for women, and that's sort of where our baby boomers came in and said, no, we're doing this. So we saw the rate of women working outside of the home go from, as I mentioned before, about 30% in 1950 to, by the time we got about 30 years later, 1980, we were nearly 60%. So that number nearly doubled in terms of women outside of the work for outside of that, working outside of the home. So that created a lot of different opportunities and challenges in our country, because what we know is that as we begin to get dual incomes in our houses, in our households, that creates the opportunity for more consumerism. And there were plenty of companies that wanted to take advantage of that, selling us everything that they possibly could, and including bigger homes. Because if we look at the silent generation, they had a tendency to invest in home ownership once, and that was the family home. That was the home that they were going to raise their kids in. And often, even today, when you're encountering those clients, you'll find that they've been in that home for 30, 40, 50 or more years. And now they're making a decision to downsize or actually, probably move into maybe assisted living or move in with family members and friends and things like that. We'll talk about what that really looks like as we move forward. But with the boomers, another thing that happens is, we've got the rate of divorce increasing as well. And part of the reason why we saw that phenomena is because women were no longer at the mercy of men to earn the income in the homes as they were in the silent generation, as they were coming up, and certainly generations prior to that. Because as women were working outside of the home, earning their own money, they had the opportunity to say, hey, I'm not in a healthy marriage, I'm going to leave and I'm going to go be by myself if necessary, go find someone else. And that really shaped the next generation, which is Generation X. And we'll talk about them in just a moment. What are some other things? Some other things our baby boomers had, that they sort of brought in. Convenience. A lot of convenience was brought into the fold because of because of both parents, both heads of household working outside of the home, and that sort of shifted the household in terms of the importance of different types of conveniences. Because if you look at the 50s and 40s, it wasn't uncommon for there to be domestic servants in the households. But as equal rights started to come into vogue, that shifted as well. So then it became the duty of the woman in the house. However, that's kind of shifted as well once she started to go to work. But then we still needed all these things done. So we saw consumerism really take hold with the need for more types of more types of product that were convenient, TV dinners, those sorts of things that just made life easier and more convenient. And I mentioned that brought us to our Generation X. So Generation X, who is born 1965 to 1980, they represent nearly 20% of the population, about 65 million of them. And in 2002, this group is aged 42 to 59 years old. So some descriptors that I've got for our Generation X: skepticism, latchkey kids, isolated, cynical, entrepreneurial, independent, quality of life and family before career, self-reliant, pragmatic, and reluctant to commit. So who are my Gen Xers in the room? We got any Gen Xers out there? All right, I see Shannon's in the chat box. She said me. So I mentioned that, and it looks like Jennifer as well. Jagka, me too. All right, fantastic. So in terms of coming of age, who would like to share with us some of the things that some of the defining moments of your life as you are sort of coming of age? Anybody like to share with us? Shannon says the Challenger explosion. Challenger explosion. Yes, that was certainly a big deal, and that was a defining moment for many Gen Xers. Building recession in the early 90s. All right, thank you. Desert Storm. That's right. Yeah. So it seems that most generations have a war associated with them, and of course, with Generation X was no different, because we look at Desert Storm and the wars on the Gulf Coast that our country was involved in. Jennifer says the Berlin Wall came down. Yes. So we started to see democracy spread in the Cold War start to come to an end. Fantastic. Thank you, Jennifer. Reaganomics, says Joe. Thank you, Joe. Yeah. So there was the sense that trickle down economics was going to work to create opportunities for everyone by incentivizing those that have, and they would then provide opportunities for those that did not have, and didn't necessarily work out in the way that everybody anticipated, because we saw the racial wealth gap continue to widen in our country. We saw poverty run rampant as well. But there's different views of that, certainly different views of that, because some folks did very well during that period and during that administration in terms of wealth creation, and that was certainly something that was demonstrated on the we saw the rise of yuppies, so to speak, and the young urban professionals, and they were making ridiculous amounts of money in terms of really earning, high earners. And again, this was a part of the reason why we saw so much trading in housing. People buying a home and being able to trade into another home, into another one, into a bigger home. Consumptionism, consumerism. We talk about having things, because when we look at our baby boomers are very much part of the car culture, where they want to have multiple cars, and classic cars now, certainly, and those types of things. They viewed automobiles as freedom, and freedom, and being able to experience that open road, and get out of sight of their parents as they were younger, and just really explore our country in many ways as well. Now, I mentioned that with Generation X, part of Generation X is, they were the victims, for lack of a better term, of the rise in divorce rates in our country, because they often found themselves as latchkey kids because of the single person households, and in both parents working, and as a result, they were often coming home to an empty house, or maybe coming to their grandparents' house, which is why in many cases they have some similarities and some sensibilities that the silent generation has, more so than their parents, which were the baby boomers. Now, I mentioned skepticism as being one of the descriptors for Generation X. One of the reasons why we saw that is because they saw the shattering of, the sort of households, the sort of the vision that they saw of having two loving parents that was kind of broken. You saw that, in the trust in our government that continued to erode as well. When we look at the Nixon administration, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things that sort of led to that level of skepticism as well. I mentioned that quality of life and family before career. So that's much different than what we saw with the baby boomers. The baby boomers were much more career over family. And another thing with the baby boomers is we saw the popularity of the pill, the birth control pill. So that really gave women more control over their reproductive rights. And as a result, we started to see household sizes shrink. And then the sizes of households have been shrinking since 1950. We'll go over a couple of those numbers as we move along as well. These are some of the things that Gen X. What are some other things? So we've got, we have cable TV, MTV. Previous generations were able to take advantage of, 3 or 4 television channels, whereas our Generation X got exposed to all types of various types of media, and really started to usher in an era where people got to sort of choose who they wanted to hear from, as opposed to everyone gathering around the one television set watching Walter Cronkite talk about, the war and what was happening. That those days had, started to go away once Generation X started to come, and we saw the sort of explosion of cable television. We also started to see a rise in technology. So we started a technology revolution during this period of time, when we saw the advent of personal computers. And depending on what age you are and what was taking place in your household, you may or may not have been what we call a digital immigrant or a digital native, because it's the digital divide and the digital bridge there with Generation X. And when I talk about being on the cusp of that, or, depending on when you grew up, where you grew up, how that affects and impacts that, what I'm really saying is that, I'll use myself for an example. In my household growing up, we did have computer, and it was because my dad was a very early adopter of technology. So we always had the latest and greatest new thing, because he was just really, really he was really interested in that technology and wanted to expose us to it and really expose himself to it. And we were just there, and we were able to take advantage of that as well. Now I'm on the younger end of Generation X, born in 1977. So younger members of Gen X have a tendency to be digital immigrants, digital natives, whereas our older Gen X members are more likely to have been digital immigrants. So that's huge. Now, when we talk about cell phones have kind of always been with us for Generation X as they were coming up, but it wasn't something that was accessible for everyone. Many of us may remember the old, the bag phone, or the phone, this huge phone that people used to carry around sometimes, and it would cost $2 and $3 a minute, that sort of thing. So that was the sort of experience with cell phones that occurred with Gen X as we were coming of age. Anybody else have some thoughts on Gen X in terms of some things that shaped their experiences or shaped Generation X's experience? All right. Well, we will move along. We will move along to our next generation. Our next generation is our millennials. So our millennials, this group is born 1981 to 1996. They represent just under 22% of the population, 72 million in 2022, and according to the census from 2020. And today, this group is 26 to 41 years old. These are our millennials. Some of the descriptors that we have for our millennials: they are technologically adept, they are connected, introverted, short attention span, individualistic, impatient, and a lot of communication in online communities. And those are our millennials. Now, the thing that we've got to remember about our millennials, though, is that they could almost be two separate generations because of the sort of age range that they have. As you see, this year in 2022, the 26 years old to 41 years old, I'll tell you, people have a lot of different things going on. People have a lot of different things going on between the time that when they're 26 years old versus when they're 41 years old. And Michelle says that that's accurate. Thank you, Michelle. So we got any other millennials in the room? Any millennials in the room? Elsie relates. Love it. Oscar is present. All right, fantastic. So when we look at the millennials, we do have older millennials and we have younger millennials, because as I was sharing, there's different things happening in your life as a 40-year-old than as a 26-year-old in many people's lives. And we look at housing, and what we know from a housing standpoint is that often household formation is a precursor to home ownership. So as a result, what we see is that, someone may have purchased their first home when, on the sort of younger end of this spectrum, but then on the older end, they may have bought their second or even third home at this point. They may have relocated a couple of times. They may have children, be married, certainly, potentially. Versus at the younger end of that spectrum, you've got folks that are maybe just now getting out of college and getting their feet wet in their careers. So there's there's a dramatic difference between those that are 26 versus those that are 41. So let's talk about some of the things that have shaped our millennials' experience as they were coming of age. So what are some things that shaped our millennials' experience coming of age? Feel free to unmute yourself and share, or type it into the chat box. Type it into the chat box if you'd like. Just some of the things that affected our millennials as they were coming of age. Internet, yes. Cassie says the internet. Michelle as well. Cell phones, absolutely. Smartphones, says Shannon. Social media, Jennifer, thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. So those are all some things that really shifted. This. Reality TV, says Shannon. Indeed. 9/11, says Oscar. Yes. Yes. Certainly. Certainly. Yeah. So let's unpack a few of these. Let me go back up in the scan here. So Cassie mentioned Cassie and Michelle both mentioned the internet. So that is very important for us to recognize that this is something that came of birth as our millennials were coming of age. Because when we look at, for myself, for example, I've been a realtor in St. Louis for 23 years. And when I started my career just 23 years ago, and there was really no such thing as the internet as it exists today. It was so much different. And when consumers and our clients wanted access to housing, they needed to talk to us. There was no such thing as realtor.com and Zillow and Trulia and homes.com and all the other places there where people are searching for homes today. And that's a huge difference in terms of how we relate to people as a huge difference in how we relate to people in terms of their home buying and selling experience. Cassie says, I remember when people said, what is www? Got it. Yes, indeed. So this is important for us to recognize, especially for those that are in older generations, because if you have been in this business, so for me, as I mentioned, I've been around for 23 years. So there's many folks that have been in business if you've been in business for over 15 years, then you were part of a market where if a buyer wanted to know what was available, they had to come to you because they didn't have access to the information any other place. Yeah, sure, they could go to open houses, they could look at the homes magazines, but in terms of having accurate, up-to-date information, 15 years ago, they got to talk to us as realtors. And so from 15 years beyond, it was very easy for realtors to define our value proposition as being the keepers of the data. Because if someone wanted to look at a home or wanted to know what was available, they had to come see us. And the challenge that we have today is that many people have been reluctant to shift from being the keepers of the data to being more of the interpreters of the data. And that's really what the consumer wants from us and needs from us today, because as we all know, the data is there. The data is out there for everyone to get. It's just the proper interpretation of that and analysis of it that is what we can provide for our clients and customers. So we talk about the internet. The internet was hugely transformative in terms of how we relate to our clients and customers from a real estate space. So some other things that, so a couple of other things we've got here in the chat. Let's see here. So we look at cell phones. Oh, and back to the internet, just in terms of delivering that information. I remember that when, I would have a client and we would have the MLS printouts. It wasn't something that everybody had it on their own little laptop. It was, there were a few MLS terminals in the office, and you would check out time or reserve time to be on there, finding those properties, and you'd print them out. We'd print those bad boys out on a dot matrix printer, and then the client or customer would come and pick them up, and we'd hand them a physical copy of this, or we would put it in an envelope, put actual stamps on it, and snail mail it to them for us to determine what homes we were going to look at potentially that weekend. So that was, that was hugely transformative, as I mentioned, and as we all know, of course, about how the internet has really influenced it. Yeah. So mention the old books, the old TTY machine, or the old books. Yeah, the MLS books that we used to have. And fortunately, I was never around when we had those MLS books. We had our Stellar system on, which was online, but it was online, and we would use a modem that was sort of plugged in to the phone line that we would use to get access to that. So yeah, so that's where the internet has really shaped a lot of it. And we've got to be cognizant of what the expectations are of our consumers today, our clients and customers, because they don't need us to tell them what's available. They need us to tell them, they need us to help guide them to what type of offer to make, helping to create seamless integration with the transaction and connect all of the various people that are involved in a real estate transaction. And unfortunately, we get in the way of that sometimes, and we have to do a better job of being of helping to make that process more smooth for them, because we're dealing with a generation who is used to pushing a button and having a pair of pants or their groceries show up at their house the next day or today even. And so that's something that we've got to consider. We have to remember that in terms of what type of experience we're providing to our clients and customers, what they're looking for. Joe says using GPS instead of the Thomas Brothers maps. Yeah, we used to have those map coordinates in our MLS system because that's what we use to get around and to find these properties. And of course, now everybody is using GPS. And of course, that was a huge blessing for me because I was never very good at navigating those maps. So that's the internet. And when we look at, so some of the other things, cell phones. So Michelle talks about cell phones, and then Shannon mentioned smartphones. So what we know is there's a huge difference between a cell phone and a smartphone. So our millennials never knew a world without cell phones for the most part. Everyone, as they were coming of age, everyone in the millennial generation had access to cell phones for the most part. Okay, they were widely adopted at that point. But we're talking about a different type of cell phone than a smartphone. We're talking about things like the Motorola flip phone, StarTAC, those types of devices, Nokia, that didn't do anything else other than make phone calls, make and receive phone calls for the most part. So that was the cell phones that our older millennials grew up with. However, when we shift to our younger millennials, many of them never knew a world without smartphones. Now, when we think about what the sort of first iterations of the smartphones were, we're looking at the BlackBerry, we're looking at the Palm Pilot, Palm Trio in terms of the phone. Those are some of the technologies that sort of were the first generation smartphones that we had. And that started to usher in the era for instant gratification and instant information. And that's what we have to work to provide to our clients, because they're looking for that instant gratification and immediacy in terms of the information that we're providing to them, because they're used to getting the questions answered for anything else at the touch of a few buttons on their phone. I've got 13 and 15-year-old daughters in Generation Z, and they're fact checking me all the time with their phones. So this is something that that not all of us have adopted, but we really need to recognize that our younger millennials, especially, and Generation Z, they're looking for that instant access and seamless integration. So then we've got social media. Yes, thank you, Jennifer. So with social media, so social media is, that had really shifted the way that we interact with many of our clients, because it allowed people to go online instead of being offline. It allowed for the sort of voyeuristic nature of many of us to, find a home, through Facebook and Twitter and other types of social media, MySpace, the predecessors there, of course. And it really shifted how people were able to interact, and people were able to sort of be present in a conversation without actually participating themselves. And that's really one of the things that social media has done. Another thing that social media has really done is it has increased the economy, that the sort of the referral economy, okay, because it allows for the crowdsourcing of information that wasn't really possible before, or possible in a convenient way. Because now, if you're thinking about buying a brand new shoes or a brand new house, you can crowdsource that information and have people weigh in on what's going to be the best new shoes for you, or the best neighborhood to buy a new home in, or things to consider, the best realtor to work with in a given market. And that's why many of us, of course, have shifted to doing a lot of our advertising and marketing in the social space, as opposed to newspapers and traditional print media, as well as television media and even radio media, because this is where our consumers are, and we can get a lot of bang for buck in terms of having our marketing dollars stretch. But yeah, that's where social media has had a tremendous impact on the real estate market. Michelle mentions email usage. Email usage, for sure, because I mentioned before that we would snail mail those MLS sheets to the clients. Now, of course, it's just a matter of communicating with them, email and attaching it, or even just sending a link to it today. So those are some things that from an email standpoint really changed the game, just in terms of how we communicate. So thank you for sharing that, Michelle. Shannon says reality TV. Oh yeah, reality TV, the real world. I remember, many of us saw the real world, The Amazing Race, Survivor, those types of things. And we see more and more of that because of the cost. It's so much cheaper to produce than the type of sort of scripted dramas and comedies that have been in our vernacular prior to the advent of reality TV. Oscar says 9/11, and what 9/11 has done, it really shifted the safety expectations of the parents of our millennials. So Generation X. And what we spoke about before, we talked about how our older generations, how Generation X had a tendency to mimic more of the silent generation than their own parents, which would have been more in the baby boomer generation. But what also happened with Generation X is that their children, the younger millennials, who were the offspring of Gen X, they became a little bit over sheltered as a result of the sort of destruction of the safety of the homeland. And it's not only the perception of the destruction, I should say, because a lot of the things that had happened have always happened, but it's because there was more of a there were more people reporting it and talking about it, that it sort of spread and creates that sense of a lack of safety. And that is certainly how 9/11 was certainly one of those events that occurred that shifted that view of safety, because this was obviously the first major attack on the U.S. homeland since Pearl Harbor in the 1940s, and this was on a civilian site that really shifted the sort of way we view war and the way we view our safety in our own country. All right, so we've got Joe mentions texting is preferred to communicating via emails or versus emails or communication or conversations. Instant communication, yes, as I discussed, instant communication. Now, what's important is that we've got to make sure that we are taking our client from where they're at, because we can't make the assumption that because our client is a millennial that they prefer to use text messaging, or make the assumption that because our client is a baby boomer, they're going to want to talk on the phone, or because our clients in the silent generation, they want to meet in person. Now, what we can do is we can create these sort of general assumptions, but in thinking that, yes, it's likely that people in this particular group are going to want to communicate in this particular way, but we need to ask them to confirm. Because I'll tell you, if my boomer client sends me a text message, my way of communicating with them is going to be through text message. Similarly, if my millennial client or Gen Z picks up the phone to give me a call, then that tells me that that's probably the way that they want to communicate. And what we also know is that even if our clients prefer to communicate in a particular meeting, especially in terms of text message, because we know that the highest form of communication is going to be that synchronous communication where I'm face to face with you in person, or I'm face to face with you via Zoom. That's going to be the highest levels of communication, and then we sort of go down the road into the telephone, voice to voice, and then email, text messaging. Those are the lowest forms of communication, or among the lowest forms of communication, only because I don't have instant reaction and instant feedback to what I'm saying. So if I'm speaking with you and you're face to face with me, I can read your visual cues, because as we know, only about 25%, I think is the number, of communication is in the words that we use. A lot of it is body language, facial expressions, things like that. And I can only see those. I can't see those over the phone. Certainly can't see those over a text message on my phone. So from that space, what we have to do is make sure that we're not communicating information to our millennial and Gen Z clients via text message that we really need to pick up the phone and have a conversation with. Because what I find is that, yes, they're willing to have those conversations, but if given the choice, they're going to guide the conversation via text message or via email. And it's up to us to say, well, that's great. We can communicate with a lot of things in this way, but on this particular issue, we need to pick up the phone and have a conversation. Or I need to come by your house and we need to talk about it. Those types of things. And that's where we, as the realtor, have to make sure that we're maintaining sort of, we're directing the conversation in that way, because we're the ones that will lose when our client loses, because we did not provide them with a good outcome as a result of the way that we allowed the communication to take place. We're the professional. So we should be guiding that direction. All right, let's see, what else do we have here? We have working from home offices, says Joe. Yes, so that is certainly something that we're dealing with now. And let's take a couple minutes to talk about that, because the question really becomes, what is this going to look like for our clients and consumers as we move forward? What we know is that the National Association of Realtors conducts a community and transportation preferences survey. They conduct this survey every couple years or so. And when we were in the throes of the pandemic in 2020, they conducted this community and transportation preferences survey in February of 2020. And then many of our communities were on lockdown in March and April and through most of the rest of the year. They conducted the test again in June of 2020 to see how things have changed. Now, what the study shows is that there was very little change in quality of life for most Americans in the top 50 metropolitan statistical areas. Where we did start to see a shift certainly is in the workplace, and how the workplace has shifted to to real estate decisions that people make. People may be willing to live further out from their place of employment, knowing that they may not be going into the office every day as they once did. And now we're seeing that shift even further, because the question becomes, the question right now, and I still think that we don't know the answer to this question, is, what does the workplace look like 5 years from now? Okay, because 2 years ago, when we first jumped into this, it was very easy to say, well, everybody's going to be working from home. Nobody's ever going back to an office again. But the reality is that people are going back to offices in some cases, but there also are a lot of people that are not going back to offices. For example, I don't know if you happen to be following what was taking place with Apple. With Apple Computer, Apple said, all right, we expect all of our employees to come back to the office 5 days a week. It's starting this month. And then all the employees said, nah, we don't feel comfortable with that. We're not going to do it. So then Apple said, okay, everybody, how about we come back to the office 3 days a week? Employees said, no, we're not coming. And because what they know is that they can go someplace else that isn't requiring them to come into the office. And what they found over these last couple of years is that their quality of work and quality of life has increased as a result of not having to drive into the office every day. So when we look at it from that standpoint, that tends to showcase that we're going to be entering a new normal, and we don't know what that new normal is going to be. I just talked with a friend of mine, or someone that I met at an event the other night. They're having trouble. He works at a communications company, a large national communications company, and he works to recruit talent. And one of the problems that he has in recruiting talent is that this particular company requires their employees to come to the office 3 days a week. And he says that once he tells people that, they go, no, I'm out. So he loses a significant amount of talent just by virtue of basically saying that they need to come into the office, because there are so many other companies that do not have that requirement today. And there's a lot of competition for that talent. So if I am a person who is in that space, and in fact, if you look at the numbers, what we know is that for every person with a college degree, there's 1.7 jobs. So there's nearly 2 jobs for everybody with a college degree. So that is pretty shocking. And that's why we've got this sort of tale of two markets when we look at our economic conditions in our country. But getting back to the real estate point of all of this, how are these decisions that people are making changing their decisions in terms of housing decisions, working from home? So people are looking for that Zoom room, looking for that home office. People are making decisions with the assumption that they're never going back to the office. Huge national company, Fortune 500 company, Centene. They built they were going to bring 3,200 employees to North Carolina. And this is just in the last 3 months. They completed this huge, beautiful campus and facility and said, hey, guess what? We're not coming. We're going to sell this, or we're going to lease it, because we're not going to move these employees to Charlotte. What we're going to do is have a distributed workforce where people are working from all over the country. We're still going to have the 3,200 people. We're going to increase our employees by the 3,200, but they're just not coming into the office, because that way we have access to a much broader pool of talent. So that's the decision that a lot of corporations and companies are making. Plus, if you've got a smaller footprint in terms of square footage, then you also have reduced your costs. So if you're reducing your real estate costs, you can reinvest that money in research and development, reinvest that money in your employees, all of those things. So those are some of the challenges and opportunities that exist with people working from home. Michelle says, you're welcome. I think that I was thanking her for her comments. And thank you, Joe, for your comments. Joe, Chip McAllister, amazing race. Yes. Work-life balance. We can't work 24/7. That is correct, because people are saying that, you know what, I don't want this, this 20-minute commute even, or 40-minute commute. I don't want to spend an hour and a half away from my family just driving to and from work. Those days are gone for me. And when we look at a lot of other, several other countries, there's a huge push for the 4-day work week, which who knows, that may be coming to a, coming to a business near you. And in fact, it may even be present in some of the employers that you talk to or work with. So those are some of the things that our millennials are really in the throes of. And as I stated, a lot of this affects real estate decisions that they're making. So we've got to be cognizant of that and understand how this particular group wants to work and likes to be worked with. I talked about them being technologically adept, being connected, having a short attention span, and that's often because of that instant access that they have. So for us as the real estate professional, we need to demonstrate our value and showcase our value in ways that are not, here are the homes that are available, and not in ways that say, well, we can open the door for you. Because that's where a lot of the mindset shifted to, where people said, well, you don't have to call me to get the information because that's been democratized. But if you want to take a look at a property, you better call me. But guess what? That door is closing as well. If you look at Canada, for example, Canada has a system where, and in some parts of Canada, where the consumer doesn't even need to call a realtor to get access to the house. They send their driver's license, to a number, and they get a code to enter the property, so they can tour the home by themselves without a realtor. So what's the value proposition now? Again, if we got rid of the value proposition being, I'm the controller of the data, okay, we've thrown that out the window. And then we get rid of the value proposition that says, okay, if you want to see a house, you've got to call me. All right, we've thrown that out the window. So what is our value? And we as realtors have to continue to work to make sure that we're defining what our value truly is to the consumer. And I would argue that that value, as I've stated before, really comes in the way and shape and form of interpretation of data and providing that seamless integration, because this is what today's consumer is really looking for, is that seamless integration, especially when we look at our millennials who have different life experiences than the boomers that preceded them, than Generation X that preceded them as well. Our millennials, they've got busy things going on in their lives. They probably have families. They're in the throes of their career. All of these things are happening. And the real estate decision is just one more thing that they're doing. They're not doing it, or excuse me, it's not the only thing in their lives, which is different, because when we look at our silent generation, this may be the only thing going on in their life, or one of the few things that are going on in their lives. That's not the case for our millennials. So with our millennials, we have to provide that seamless integration there. Cassie says, realtors value staying educated in the market and data. Absolutely. So we stay educated and we provide convenience for the client. And that's what's going to help us win in today's market. It's just like, I look at my, I spent some time painting in my house over the weekend, and I hated every minute of it. And every time I said, why didn't I just call somebody to come and do this instead of me toiling away at it myself? And that's what we have to think about from the consumer experience when we look at for sale by owners, when we look at people that are looking to sort of navigate this market on their own. We need to help them understand the value proposition that we have by coming to the table. Now, in terms of millennials and the decisions that they make, one of the things that's important to recognize is that our millennials, so the average age of a first-time home buyer in today's market is, what do you think? Let's take a guess at it. Throw it in the chat box. What do you think the average age of a first-time home buyer is? And do you think that it's up or down? So put the number and say if you think that it's up or down. So the average age of a first-time home buyer, what is the number, and is it up or is it down? All right, so we've got Cassie says 33 and up, and it's up. Lynn says 33, and oops. Michelle says 35 and it's up. Joe says 45 and it's down. Lynn says up. Michelle says up. Oscar 32 and down. Elsie 25. Lynn says up or down from what point? Up or down from the last 30 years or last 40 years or last 50 years. Take your pick, because it is certainly something in one direction over that period of time. Same question as Lynn. 15 years ago, says Elsie, I'd say 25 and up. Okay. All right, fantastic. Well, I will share with you that Cassie is absolutely right. The first respondent, Cassie said that it is 33 and it is up. Also, Lynn said 33. Ding, ding, ding for Lynn as well. The average age of a first-time home buyer in 1980 was 26 years old. 26 years old in 1980, and we've been going up and up and up since then. What are some reasons that you think that the average age of a first-time home buyer is up in the United States? These are national figures. Anyone want to take a crack at that? Some reasons? There's multiple reasons, certainly. Michelle, I love it. People having kids later. Yes, yes, that is huge. That is huge. Because what we know is that, as I stated before, I believe that home ownership is a byproduct of household formation. So people getting married later and having kids later means that necessarily they're going to invest in home ownership later. So that's certainly in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons why we're seeing that trend occurring. Cassie says better jobs. Thank you, Cassie. And also with better jobs, what I would say is partially with that is freedom. So meaning that the consumer wants to make a decision about where they live, where they want to work, those types of things, but they view home ownership as more of an anchor than their parents and grandparents did. Now, that sort of leads us to what I believe is another huge reason that we see the home ownership, the for average age of a first-time homeowner going up, and that's because of the views of millennials. The views of millennials, we have to remember when they were coming of age. When they were coming of age, during the Great Recession. So they saw their parents, older siblings, fall victim to the housing crisis, potentially being upside down in their home, face foreclosure or short sales, or become locked into a house that they couldn't sell and not being able to move as a result of that. They also may have saw, accidental landlords sort of happening, from their family members. So this was the only generation. The millennials were the only generation in our nation's history to see a decline in housing values. That is remarkable, because if we look at our boomers, they were trading up and up and up. They'd buy a house, 5 to 7 years later, they'd sell that house and buy another one. 5 to 7 years later, they'd sell that one and buy another one and keep the change. So that was what was happening with our boomers. So our millennials just saw something different, and certainly our Generation X saw something different too, as well as from that space. The millennials saw that, hey, home ownership, the house isn't necessarily going to appreciate in value every time. That's what they saw. Now the question today is going to be, I'd love to see how they're viewing this today, because we have seen a bit of a shift, a remarkable shift over the last 10 to 12 years since the Great Recession. So that's one of the reasons that millennials are putting off home ownership, because although they see home ownership as something that they want to aspire to, they see it more for the sort of something of my own standpoint of it, but less so the investment piece of it and the appreciation piece of it. But I think that question may be answered differently in 2022 versus how it was answered in 2018, 2015, 2012, certainly. All right, so Joe says living at home with family members. Yes. Yeah, that is the case. So we have a record number of 18 to 34-year-olds living at home. Nearly 18% of 18 to 34-year-olds still live at home, which has gone up from the historic sort of 14, 15% of those folks. Michelle says, less pressure to work and people going to college instead. Thank you, Michelle. All right. Affordability, says Joe. Current challenge is interest rates going up. Oh my gosh, Joe, you're preaching to the choir with those interest rates. My goodness. But do we think that that's going to be a long-term struggle for the consumer, or is that going to be a short-term blip? My answer to that is probably going to be more of a short-term blip. The reason for that is because if we look over the last 50 years, the average interest rate is 7.5%. So although we're staring down 7% interest rates, we're still in a space where we're below the average over the last 50 years. Now, I know that, you know, today's consumer doesn't necessarily care about that. What they care about is that interest rates were 3% a year ago. That's what they care about. But what I believe needs to happen is we get a new crop of people that are coming into the market, people that are coming in to make the decisions, and they weren't thinking about 2.5% interest rates at the time that those are being offered. So this is my payment, and this is how much house I can afford. It is what it is. Let's keep it moving, because now's the time for home ownership. Because when we look overall at consumers and the decisions they make in terms of when they invest in home ownership, it's typically not because of the market. It's because it was just the right time for them. And that just the right time for them typically coincides with household formation, coincides with having children, you know, those sorts of things, coincides with relocating your in place of employment, or becoming more stable in your place of employment. Those types of things are typically what's going to drive the boat on that. All right, fantastic. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about those numbers as we move along. Gen Z, let's talk about Gen Z for a moment. Gen Z is born 1997 to 2012. They represent 20.3% of the population. 67 million of these folks in our country today. And in 2022, the oldest members of this group are 25 years old. So do we have any Gen Zers in the room? Any Gen Zers? Some of the descriptors that we've got, you know, so Gen Z is the most racially and ethnically diverse cohort. 1 in 4 members are non-Hispanic white. Excuse me, 1 in 4 members are Hispanic, while 52% are non-Hispanic white, and 14% are Black. A total of 6% are Asian, and the remaining 4% are of another racial identity, primarily 2 or more races. The majority of the individuals live in metropolitan areas in Western states, with just 13% of our Gen Z living in rural areas. So some of the things that I think, one of the things we got to recognize about Gen Z is, by and large, they're not making a whole lot of real estate decisions. But guess what? They're going to be driving the boat for many years to come over the next several years. And although the oldest members of this group is 25 years old, getting back to the point that I was trying to make earlier about, will the average age go down as a result of what we've seen in our market over the last 3 to 4 years? And my argument would be yes, the average age would go down, because I perceive that we are going to continue to see home values rise. They're not going to rise at the 10 to 15% levels that many of our markets have seen around the country, and in some cases, obviously, much more than that. But I think that they're going to still rise because we've got some fundamental challenges in terms of a housing shortage. There's just not enough houses to meet the demand of consumers, and population growth. So if we look back at 2008, the Great Recession in 2008, what we know is that we need over a million, about 1.2 million housing units just to sustain population growth. So from the years of 2008 to 2012, we didn't build 1.2 million housing units. In fact, we built just about 500,000 units per year, which means that just in that 4-year period, we were down about 2 million housing units nationwide. And then from 2012 to where we sit today, we still haven't really gotten to that 1.2 million unit. And obviously the pandemic played a part in that over the last few years because of supply disruptions, but we're still not there. So my point with that is that we're not, in my opinion, we're not going to see a decline in housing value as we saw in 2008 because the fundamentals are so much different. In 2008, 2004, 5, 6, and 7, as we know, people barely needed to fog a mirror to get a loan. If you had a pulse, you're good enough to get financing. That's not the case in today's market, nor the market that we've been in over the last 3 years. What we've seen is that people not only did they need to qualify, in many cases they were overqualified, meaning they were putting much larger down payments than traditionally had done to compete with other competition, that other offers on the table. Many were paying cash, and of course maybe borrowing those funds from a family member or using other lines of credit and resources to do that. So that in and of itself creates a climate and an environment which is not going to lend itself to people just turning in the keys and walking away because they have equity. So that in and of itself is going to be one of the reasons why I believe that we're not going to see a decline in housing values. Another reason why I don't think we're going to see a decline in housing values is because interest rates have gone up so substantially over the last 3 months, let alone over the last year. And in talking with folks, even over the weekend, and this is true of myself and what I believe. So people that have locked in interest rates at 2.5%, 2.25%, 2.75%, those folks aren't necessarily interested in selling their home unless they have to. They're done. They're not moving because often, and this is true of myself, I bought my house 2 years ago. I couldn't afford my house if I had to buy it today at 7% interest rates. My rate is at 2.6%. So that's the case that a lot of people have. So a lot of people are not going to be moving for that very reason. And that's going to create even more strain on supplies. And because there's more strain on supplies, that's going to necessarily push values even higher, because there just isn't enough inventory to meet the demands of the consumer. So that's what I think we have what we're going to continue to have on the horizon. So that 33 in terms of the average age of a first-time home buyer, I think that number is going to go down. I think it's going to go down because people want to invest in home ownership while they still can. Because the homes today that people are buying, they would have been able to buy for 15, 20, 30% less 3 and 4 years ago in markets all over the country. And I think that Generation Z is paying attention to that, as is our younger millennials. So let's see here. So what questions, comments do you have at this point? Anybody have any questions or comments about any of the things that we've talked about? It looks like Joe has something here. More parents in today's market are willing to provide some financial help with down payments or go on title with children. Yes, thank you, Joe. Thank you. Other comments, questions that you have at this point? All right, if you have any, feel free to throw them in the chat or unmute yourself and say it loud and proud. Okay, so we've got, let's see here. All right, Oscar asks, how else can we target these generations? So one of the ways that we can target the generations is by going where they're at, okay? So if we look at, let me grab a drink of water here. Okay, so how else can we target these various generations? So if we think about the sensibilities that the different generations have, then that can be helpful in us in our marketing efforts. So for example, if we know that Generation Z and our millennials are looking for that seamless integration, then our value proposition to them is helping them understand how smooth we're going to make the transaction for them. That's not necessarily the concern that our older generation may have. For example, our boomers and our silent generation. Our boomers may be more concerned about us maximizing the value in their current home. So we're going to showcase our marketing, and we're going to direct our marketing in that way in terms of helping them understand what services we're going to provide that help them maximize the value of their home, because that's going to be a bigger concern that particular group has. And as we continue the conversation, Oscar, we're going to jump into some more information about how we can target some of these different generations. But, in a nutshell, I would say, number one, finding out where they're at, okay? And then number two, highlighting their specific needs and concerns. And we'll discuss both of those things as we move along. Lynn says, I like the theory of supply and demand driving the prices. Thank you, Lynn. Michelle says, how do we address generational gaps in real estate as a whole, like the new technologies such as DocuSign? So, Michelle, are we speaking about generational gaps in real estate in terms of practitioners, our realtors, or in terms of the clients and consumers? Because there is a difference.
Yeah. So I'll just go ahead and speak on this one. Like I know with some escrow companies, even like they will not accept DocuSigns. Like they will require getting a hand signature for certain forms and things like that. And I think a lot of this has to do with like using like a traditional, like, okay, it has to be hand signed, where I think there are some legit securities in using DocuSign in terms of transactions, unless it needs to be like notarized, which I totally understand, like someone having a mobile notary coming to them. But for just the sake of, just car forms, I would essentially just, utilize something fast and efficient.
Yes. Thank you, Michelle. It's shocking to me that you have title companies that aren't accepting electronic signatures, because that is absolutely the direction that the consumer is heading in and has been heading in for many years. And what happens is if we don't adopt these newer technologies, then we're going to become dinosaurs and we're going to get left behind, because we become an impediment to the process as opposed to being a benefit to the process. An example of that, Michelle, is with earnest money. So I remember the first time my client asked me, and probably wasn't the first time, but over a period of time with my clients, I would say, okay, well, we need an earnest money check. We need you to write a check for earnest money to the title company. And as I started to realize that my clients didn't have checks, they would have to go to the bank and get a temporary check or get a cashier's check. I realized that, wow, this earnest money situation is a real impediment to our process. Why are we forcing people to write these paper checks when that's just not how they're doing business today? We talked earlier about how commerce operates. People are using, their cards, they're using their phone, they're doing all this stuff seamlessly. And we've got to get in front of that. And fortunately, I know here in St. Louis, we use a technology called trust funds. So many of us don't ever have our clients write checks anymore unless they want to, but we instead have them do an ACH transfer that goes directly to the title company. And that way it keeps us from having to disrupt our clients' busy lives to have them run to the bank to get a check and bring it back to the title company, or have us meet them, or risk us leaving the check on the photocopier like we used to do when we would take a copy to send. So in answer to your question, Michelle, what you have to do is talk with these title companies and help them understand that if you're not going to adapt to today's technology, because this isn't even new technology. We've been using DocuSign and the like for the last, over a decade, I would say. So if these title companies are not willing to adopt today's standards, then we need to go somewhere else. Help them understand that you're going to have to adapt to this, or we're going to have to seek other professionals that are in this space and that are willing to adapt to today's technology. And yes, I agree with you completely, Michelle, in terms of there are some documents that need to be notarized, but even through that, we use, there's a mechanism that we use that has the remote notary that occurs where people are able to sign, with them on the screen and, do a few sort of gymnastics in that way that overcomes that fraud concern that people have. So again, it's just about helping the vendors understand the realities of how their process is an impediment to a smooth transaction for clients. And that lack of a smooth transaction is one of the reasons why there are many companies out there looking to disintermediate us and remove us from the transaction, because we are seen as being dinosaurs and creating cumbersome an unnecessarily level of cumber within the process. Joe says the majority of escrow and title companies are okay with DocuSign. Fraud is the concern. Yes. Joyce, my friend purchased 2 investment properties for her 2 millennial daughters as their first homes when they were able to make payments instead of renting when they graduated college. I love it, Joyce, and we should all be doing so much more of that because first of all, that's our business, but second of all, it's an amazing way to work to create generational wealth and start the next generation with an understanding that home ownership is the path to financial independence as well. So that's critically important, especially when we look at today's market in terms of how not all consumers are viewing home ownership as something that they want to achieve. So that's a concern as well that we have. So thank you for sharing those thoughts, those comments. All right, so quickly think of these. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but just think about what the ages are of the oldest and youngest people in your family. And this is in your family in terms of just the people that you're hanging out with in your family, maybe in your household, maybe in your extended family. What are the ages of the oldest and youngest people in your office? And where do you fit in those age ranges, those ages and generations in your family and office? And then think about how generational differences affect communication in your family and office. So let's think about that for a quick minute. Okay, and let me know if you've got any thoughts on that, or if there's any ahas that you came up with in that sort of exercise there. All right, great. As we move along, I want to highlight here our population, and we touched on the sort of difference in the sort of difference in how our population is shifting. Oscar says, older generations will require a phone call versus young generations will be okay with texting. Thank you, Oscar. Yes, thank you. So in 1950, we see that households that were married with children represent the largest household demographic in the United States. And by 2015, although that population that's married with children grew, they no longer represent the largest household demographic. In fact, they're not even in second place. They are in third place behind households that were married with kids, excuse me, married without kids, married with no children in the home, which has nearly doubled since 1950. And that's due to a couple of things. People that are putting off having kids till later, or not having kids at all, and also older couples living together longer after the kids have moved on. But the thing I want to point out here is the single person households. In 1950, single person households barely registered on the map, and now they are in second place, almost the largest household demographic in our nation. And the question becomes, are we building housing that aligns with the demands of that single person household? And the answer in most cases is no. And when we are building housing, it tends to be rental housing, apartments, but not so much for home ownership opportunities. I promised I was going to get back to the millennials in terms of our population and what was relevant about the average age of that first-time home buyer. Take a look at this. You can see the red line there. The red line is right over 33 because 33 is the average age of a first-time home buyer, as we discussed earlier. Now, what I want you to notice is that over the next 3 years, the next 4 years or so, 4 to 5 years, we're going to see an increase in the amount of people turning 33 years old. So we're going to see an increase in the number of people who are turning the average age of a first-time home buyer. That's really significant because, as we said, or at least as I said, I think that average age is going to go down. So that's going to come home even more, because if you look across the board into Generation Z, you can look down and you can easily see that over the next 15 years or so, we're going to see a pretty significant increase in the amount of potential homeowners that are coming into the market. And this is why I don't believe that we're going to see a decline in home values, because our millennials, followed by our Generation Z, are going to hold up the sort of the housing market in terms of getting into the space, looking to make real estate decisions. And a lot of those real estate decisions are going to be in investing in home ownership. Changing household composition. The average household now is 2.51 people, which is over 25% smaller than it was in 1950. Last year, more than 28% of all households were singles. So that is pretty significant to consider. Joe says, less people are getting married. Yes, family values are changing. Many couples are deciding to remain single. That is absolutely correct. We are definitely seeing a shift in that, in terms of what traditional families look like, so to speak. And there once was a stigma on single women not getting married, and that's gone by the wayside quite a bit. And in fact, when we look at home ownership, the average age, not the average age, the percentage of single men who buy homes are about 8 to 9%, whereas the percentage of single women who buy homes is 16 to 17%. So single women buy homes at twice the rate that single men buy homes. So that's something I think is rather remarkable as well. By 2030, the population aged 65 and older will represent 20% of the US population, and the number of households headed by this group will double from 2005 to 2030. So that's fairly significant as well. So let's talk about some myths and realities of aging. So the myth that we've got is that older people are all the same. Of course, the reality is that older people are diverse. Myth is that families dump relatives into nursing homes. Reality is that nursing homes tend to be a last resort for most families. Myth, older equals ill and disabled. Whereas the reality is that 50% of older adults, and by older, we're talking about our older boomers and our silent generation, rated their health as good to excellent. Myth is that older people are lonely and gradually withdraw. The reality is that older adults have close friends and relationships. This was something that came as a surprise to me. When my mother, who's a school teacher, retired few years ago, I and my two sisters were concerned. What's mom gonna do? What are we gonna do with mom? She's gonna be lonely. She's gonna be by herself. She's got nothing to do. Come to find out, she's got a bunch of friends and she's always traveling and gone with her friends hanging out. And we were like, wow, we had no idea that she even had friends. So that is certainly a myth. And the reality is that they do have close relationships and friends. Driver safety. The ability to continue driving is a top concern for maintaining independence among our older populations. As we mentioned before, our boomers and older really love cars, whereas our millennials and younger, not so much. We look at the average age that someone gets their driver's license among millennials and below is 18 years old. And of course, we know the legal age to drive is 16. So people are waiting on average a couple years longer to get their driver's license because they just don't necessarily see the value in having it, because they don't view car culture in the same way that their parents and grandparents did. Joe says 60 is the new 40. Many older people are more active along with working and living longer. That is for sure. Joe, thank you for sharing that. Great book I read recently, This Chair Rocks, and it's about ageism. And they discuss how that, often we have a perception of what a person at a specific age should be or should do. And one of the quotes that I thought was good in that book was that, well, if you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one 80-year-old, because the reality is that they're so much different than we give them credit for. And another point that was made is about who's more likely to have things in common, a group of 17-year-olds or a group of 70-year-olds. And the 17-year-olds are probably going to be much more likely to have some stuff in common than the 70-year-olds because of the lived experiences that are inherent between those two different age spectrums. So that's something that I thought was eye-opening, because sometimes we do have a tendency to put everybody of a certain age in a box, or to say that this is what 60 looks like, or this is what 80 looks like, when the reality is that people age differently, and there's a lot of diversity in health outcomes and outcomes in terms of their interests as well. Myth, so thank you for sharing that, Joe. Myth, older people are more likely to become victims of crimes. The reality is that older people are less likely to be victims of crime. Myth, every retiree wants to live in Florida. The reality is that retirees live in the same states as the US general population. Our myth, older people don't use technology, and we know that generations aged 50 and older are very internet connected. So understanding how we age. So our health, so we've got our hearing. So we tend to lose our hearing as we get into our mid-30s, and continues to digress as we get older. Our vision starts to diminish into our 40s and starts to digress from there as well. Our cognitive ability remains fairly constant well into our 90s, provided we continue to use it and we don't have things such as Alzheimer's, dementia that occur. And that's not common. It's certainly not as common as we have a tendency to think it is sometimes. Temperature. Our body has trouble regulating temperature as we age, so that's where we become hot or cold in rooms that we shouldn't be. Our weight tends to increase as we get into our 60s. Then as we get into our 70s, we tend to lose weight. Our height starts to shrink as we get into our 40s because of fallen arches, poor posture, those sorts of things. So working with our matures. So one of the things that we need to do with working with matures is help them feel empowered. We want to provide testimonials and resume. They prefer face-to-face communication, be on time. Of course, we should be on time with everyone. and shake hands. That these are some important things. And again, this could very easily be titled generational generalities, because this is what we can assume some of these things for some of these groups. But again, we want to take everybody for the individual that they are and treat them as they would like to be treated. Another thing with working with maturers, ask a lot of questions, offer options and explain the details, schedule specific time for follow-up, and be aware of physical limitations. 29% of the silent generation purchased in senior related housing, and they tended to purchase new homes. So we see that the silent generation represented 7% of all buyers and 12% of all sellers. Working with boomers. Working with boomers, we want to emphasize our network of experts. We want to back up our knowledge, provide the highlights. Our marketing should be age targeted and not age restricted. Remember, our boomers hate rules. They want us to demonstrate what we're doing for them, interact in person, by telephone, or via email, appeal to the active lifestyle. Remember, our boomers are forever young. This group, our boomers, are the group that is most likely to use proceeds from a previous home sale to finance the purchase of their next home. Sellers 54 years and older often downsized and purchased smaller, less expensive homes than they sold. And as we see, we've got our younger boomers represented 18% of buyers, 21% of sellers. Older boomers represented 14% of all buyers and 22% of all sellers. So let's look at the client across the desk. So think about what their life stage is. Whether this person is older or younger, what is going on in their lives? Do they have children at home? Do they have grown children that are in a position that they're helping them make a decision? What are their needs and wants? What is the reality of why they're making this move? Is it because their family's growing? Is it because their family's shrinking? Is it because they're getting to a space where they can no longer handle the stairs anymore, or they don't need this big house anymore, or they need to be closer to family members because of their age? What's the health and activity stage of this client? Who has the aging issue if we're dealing with an aging client? Of course, all of our clients are aging, but if we're dealing with a client whose age is of concern in the transaction or in their space in life. Because what we know is that it may not be the person. So you've got an 85-year-old sitting across the table. They may not be the ones that want to make this move. It may be their children or even their grandchildren that are really sort of pushing this agenda for them making the move. And you've got to work to make them feel empowered that they're the ones making the decision, because they may feel like they're not in charge of this situation, and we want to help empower them in that case. Could be a long time since the last transaction. We may be dealing with someone who is a surviving spouse. As we discussed before, it's very likely that our silent generation, they raised their family in this home. So they've lived there for 40 or 50 years. So it could be a very emotional time as a result of that. And they could have experienced the loss of the financial decision maker. I had a client not long ago, helped the couple. They were in their 60s, 70s, helped them buy a home here in St. Louis. They were coming from a different market. They wanted a second home in St. Louis because of his medical needs and spending so much time in the hospital. They, instead of spending money on hotel rooms, they thought investing in another second home would be good, which it was for them. Fortunately, he passed away not long after that. And she called us and said, "Hey, Nate, we want to sell this house. I want to sell this house because I don't really want to be in St. Louis. The only reason we bought the house there is because of, the needs of her spouse." And what we found out is that she did not have any real understanding of what was taking place in terms of the finances of her and her husband, because he took care of all of that. So of course, we took great care of her and he took great care of her before he passed in terms of providing for resources for her. And they were able to make money on the home that they sold. And she was able to move back to her place, and everything was fine. The point there is that we can't assume that just because someone has bought several homes that they know what's going on, because it's possible that the financial decision maker was not them. So that's something to consider. Working with Gen X. Gen X wants us to help negotiate the price and details. They want us to handle the paperwork, help interpret information, and fill in information gaps. This is what Gen X is looking for from us. Because remember, what we know is that the data is available. The data is available, but our clients and consumers often just need us to interpret that information and fill in those gaps, as I've stated. Working with Gen X, provide fast responses. This is the group that tends to search the longest before making a real estate decision. They want us to deliver everything yesterday. We've got one chance to get it right with Gen X. They expect us to have the information and have it right. This is our craft. This is our profession. All right. So it looks like Joyce is looking to make a love connection with Joe's mom, or actually with Joe's husband, maybe, or with Joe. I'm not sure exactly. At any rate, Joe says many grandparents are moving or buying second homes in order to be closer to children and grandchildren. Yes, absolutely. Cassie finds my jokes funny. At least somebody does.
I got to clarify something, Nate, real quick.
Yes.
And that's a side joke. Her mom is Joyce's mom is wonderful, but her age is unlisted. She does not reveal her age, so it's just a side joke.
Oh, got it. Thank you, Joe. All right, so Gen Xers made up the largest generation of home sellers at 25%. As you see, Gen X represented 25% of home sellers and 24% of all home buyers. Working with millennials, our millennials, we need to know your technology, ensure seamless integration. I said that 1,000 times today. Provide convenience, interpret the data. And this group tends to be more diverse than other generational cohorts that are older than them. So I mentioned that there's a record high number of 25 to 34-year-olds living in their mama's basement. So as you see, if we go back to 2000, we saw about 11%, and that number has risen to nearly 17% as of 2018, and it continues to rise. So that's something to consider. And we know that the reason for that, there's a variety of reasons for that. Sometimes it's a matter of not wanting to, the millennial not wanting to rent or buy anything until they've moved to a market that they know that they're going to be in for a while. Their parents may not want them to leave. And, also the housing shortage and inventory shortage. There may not be good housing for them to move to. So those are factors as well. So nearly half of older millennials have a median student debt amount of $30,000. So as we see, our younger millennials represent 11% of home buyers and 2% of sellers. Our older millennials represent 26% of buyers and 18% of sellers. So that is pretty significant for us to consider. All right, so let's run over this generational quiz. So questions, hopefully you guys will answer. We've covered all of this stuff through our conversation. So let's see, which is the largest generational group of home buyers? Which is the largest generational group of home buyers? Who remembers this one? Don't be shy. All right, we've got boomers. We've got a couple of boomers, and the answer is millennials. I am clearly not doing my job. The largest generational group of home buyers is millennials. The largest generational group of home sellers, if we combine the older boomers with the younger boomers, would be boomers. So I'm going to pretend that you read that as largest group of home sellers. This generation came of age during the birth of rock and roll. This is the silent generation. The silent generation came of age during the birth of rock and roll, who watched from Earth as Neil Armstrong planted a US flag on the moon. Who did that? Oh, boomers. Yeah, Lynn, Michelle, you're absolutely right. Which generation searched the longest amount of time before buying? You may remember this one. That is right, Joe. Joe is paying attention. Gen X. Lynn as well. Oscar, love it. All right, Generation X is correct. Their arrival led to a dramatic rise in demand for housing, cars, and roads. They were the generation preoccupied with the Vietnam War and helped launch the environmental movement. Those are our boomers. Yes, Lynn, very good. Thank you. Which generation was most likely to use proceeds from a previous home sale to finance their purchase? Yes, Lynn, our boomers once again. Boomers once again. Thank you, Joe. They saw the end of the Cold War, the fall of communism, and the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. With the rise of MTV and the beginnings of the internet, they became a technologically savvy and entrepreneurial group. That is Gen X. Yes, Gen X. This generation is very diverse. 41% of them identify as Hispanic or non-white. They grew up in an environment of unrest and heightened security coming of an age in post-September 11th world. They are referred to as digital natives and are often the first consumers of newest technologies and gadgets. Those are our millennials. Yes, Lynn. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Michelle. All right, so let's look at some generational generalities. And again, you know, as we're getting into this, our final 10 minutes, any questions, comments, concerns that you've got about anything that we discussed, or other specific questions, things that you'd like for me to talk about that I've not talked about or covered? If so, just throw it in the chat. You know, work to get it covered. So some generational generalities. Going back to our GI generation, remember, energetic, patriotic, courageous, loyal, community-oriented, hardworking, team players, and respectful of authority. Our silent generation, cautious, conformist, risk-averse, unimaginative, industrious, prudent, unquestioning of authority. Our baby, yes, feel free to unmute and speak up. Yes, Elsie, thank you. Our baby boomers are ambitious and optimistic, individualistic, seeking immediate gratification, hardworking, competitive, materialistic, and forever young. Our Gen X, skeptical, latchkey kids who are isolated, cynical, entrepreneurial, independent, quality of life, and family before career, self-reliant, pragmatic, and reluctant to commit. Our millennials, empathetic with elders, sheltered, tolerant, sensitive to multiculturalism, hopeful, overscheduled, multitaskers with a short attention span. Okay, so when working with matures, what we have to remember is that they remember when full service gas stations. They feel that service isn't what it used to be. They may appear overly indecisive or cautious in terms of making decisions because, again, it could have been a very long time since they made a real estate decision. Their decisions are driven by circumstance, not the market. They may be concerned with their image when downsizing. They value personal referrals. They see technology as a handy tool for communication, news, and personal business. They may have little time to occupy. They may have little to occupy their time and may fill it with repeated calls to the real estate professional. So remember, this particular group, in contrast to our millennials, often this is the largest thing going on in their lives. And they want to know what's next. And that's why we as realtors need to make sure that we are letting them know what's the next steps of the process are going to be at every step along the way. The real estate professional, we should help them feel empowered to make good decisions, provide testimonials and resumes, strive for face-to-face communication, courtesy and formality, address them as Mr. and Mrs. and do not use first names, be on time for all appointments, shake hands, ask a lot of questions to find out what they really want, and don't patronize them, offer options and explain all of the details, schedule specific time for follow-up, and explain that you'll address all their concerns at that appointment. Be aware of any physical limitations that they may have. Working with our boomers value convenience and customization. They don't need emotional support or hand-holding. They hate rules. They're generally not need-driven or in a hurry. They value representation of interests, managing the process, pricing properties right, and one-stop shopping. They expect a timely response, but not necessarily instant turnaround. They want and expect expert services and advice. They don't want information they can find themselves. They're comfortable with technology. It is a basic need. We should emphasize our network of experts, be able to back up our knowledge with experience and credentials, provide the highlights. Our marketing should be age targeted and not age restricted. Inspire loyalty by demonstrating what we are doing for them. Interact in person, by telephone, or over email, and appeal to the active lifestyle. Working with Gen X, they want us to provide access and get the paperwork done. They don't need hand-holding or emotional support. They're pragmatic risk takers who are results oriented. They've got a sense of entitlement, high tech, low touch, expect prompt response. They're skeptical. They rely on themselves to find the data. They already know the good deals. They're aware of things. We as the real estate professional should help negotiate price and details, handle the paperwork, fill in the information gaps, provide fast responses within 2 hours, deliver everything yesterday, and realize that there's only one chance to get it right. Don't try to sell them anything. They hate being sold. They're skeptical of salespeople. Our millennials are high-tech, low-touch, pragmatic, but empathetic with elders, tolerant of diversity. They prefer directness over subtlety, action over observation. They're crunched for time as they're always multitasking, heavily influenced by media and peers. Technology is a way of life, and high-speed instant access is expected. We as the real estate professional should, above all, keep cool, be accustomed to multitasking, communicate by texting and social media, avoid pretensions, never overpromise. So those are our generational generalities. And let's look at some information from our home buyer and seller generational trends. So our younger millennials represented 11% of recent buyers, and older millennials represented 26% of recent buyers. 16% of Gen X bought a multi-generational home. That is important because there's not enough of that inventory to meet the demands of the consumer. We should consider that. Our younger boomers spent about 12 weeks searching for a home, and the older boomers actually moved a median distance of 30 miles between their previous home and their new home. Silent generation, 29% of them purchased in senior related housing, 34% will never move. So when we think about our value proposition, what is your value proposition for the market? What are the services and expertise, qualifications, experience that distinguish you from your competitors? How would you express these in terms of client service? So think about a tagline that would be 10 words or less that communicates your value proposition to either your millennial, your Gen X, your mature boomer buyers and sellers. So consider that. We're not going to spend much time on that, but that's something to think about, because as we were discussing earlier, what is the value proposition that we offer? And that value proposition is going to vary depending on the generational cohort that we're working with. So in understanding those generational generalities that we've discussed, it's going to take us a long way in terms of helping our multi-generational clients make the right decision. To restate a couple things, first-time buyers made up 30% of all home buyers. The typical buyer is 47 years old. 61% of buyers were recent married couples. 17% were single females. 9% were single males. So those are our generational differences. So I hope that you got value out of our conversation today. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Elsie. If there are any questions, I'd certainly be happy to answer those. It's been great spending the afternoon with you, and I hope that you got value out of our conversation.
Thank you, Nate. I don't have anything. So if nobody else has any questions, then we can go ahead and close it out. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Cassie. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks for your kind words. Appreciate that. Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Joyce. Thank you all for your participation. Thanks, Michelle. Glad that you found value in the conversation.